Testing. Okay. So today's video is a bit different, as you can notice. The traditional hoodies back up here, and I'm in my Nike robe. So I'm making this video because this is something I've been thinking about for a while, and this isn't the tradition. So like all my videos normally, they're not pre-recorded. There's no editing, right? It's all on the spot. But this one more so because this is an issue that I've been thinking about more recently in my mind. And also, I think it's really important. So I'm going to be just talking freehand. I don't know how long it's going to be. Hopefully, if you stay, thank you very much. But let's talk about selfishness and how that manifests in today's society. So, as the typical format, we go through this whole, introduction thing. I still have my stuff saved from the last video, but right here we are. We have this whole stuff. But let's kind of go through this process again. So introducing, why do I think this is a problem? So I really only came to this idea because I was like doom scrolling on my phone for like an hour or so right now, before it's like 10 p.m. right now. And I get a lot of like, obviously this channel and stuff. So I get a lot of political content, right? A lot of political stuff that I take a look at. And the most interesting part is, I have some like, I have some bias obviously in my feed, like a bit more right-wing stuff maybe, but also I make sure to have some like left-wing stuff, right? And that's not the point, but I see a lot of different creators with different ideas, and that's fine, right? Different people have different perspectives, and if you have a big platform and you're recognized as a mainly political channel, you probably have some validity to your statements, although I might disagree with certain things here and there. So based on that, these aren't unintelligent people, right? People making these political videos, as like myself, right? The most concerning thing I found was the comment section. And, obviously you might say, oh, these are, internet trolls. These are people in, they're young, they're in their 20s. But the worrying part is that the lack of awareness and the simple, people don't realize that they have the potential to be wrong, and they really cannot see it's two sides of an issue, and they are very emotional. So like, this isn't anything new. We already know this stuff, right? We already know that people are emotional online, especially when it comes to politics, and they can't really make rational decisions. And as we've explored, humans aren't rational. We have to be, emotional. But we've also discussed how you can get away from that by making your emotion, you could channel your emotion into righteousness, which strives you to, find both sides, to make decisions based on specific policies, specific issues, right? And the reason why I think this is really important, because we might say that these people aren't knowledgeable, that they're irrelevant, but these are the current and the future of America, the world, the West, right? Civilization. And when you see a lot of these people, you realize that these are the people who are speaking out the most. These are the people who make these, like, frankly, misguided comments. They really truly hold these ideas. And you might say, oh, these, there's equally as many people with the right ideas. And I would probably agree, but those people aren't the ones making impassioned, like speechful speeches in the comment sections of political videos. And I think that's really interesting because, why is that? Why is there not as many people doing that? And that's because it's the people who aren't controlled by emotion primarily that are able to actually process information and think about things critically without relying on short-term gratification when it comes to an idea being good in your head, right? So for example, like, you think something, you want to stand by something because you think it sounds good in your head, or you think that it's going to be good, or it's socially popular. We've seen that a lot nowadays. And I'll go into some more specifics. That's the whole point of making this video. But I was just lost in thought, because it's disappointing, really. It's really disappointing seeing a lot of people who are simply unable to see any nuance at all. And these are people who have the loudest voices. These are the people who are getting the most interactions, because it's either inflammatory or their own extreme side believes them. And this goes for both sides. Obviously, I will probably be tending to focus more on, like, neocons, neolibs, right? People who are on the extreme of either side. But it's a lot of these new age folks that are really falling into this trap. And the one thing I found about this, so that we know why this is about selfishness, is this isn't only about being misguided. A lot of these ideas, especially from the left, is about being selfish. as individuals, as society. And on the right, the biggest problem is the lack of empathy, the lack of actual solvency. And we'll get into these issues. And both of them are kind of selfish because it's all really about just political persuasion and, using certain arguments here when they don't really apply, or changing your political stance based on what's convenient for the time. So let's start with the first example. So I saw a lot of videos about abortion because it's still, despite being, years after Roe v. Wade was finally overturned, it's still a big issue because obviously, we're still deciding whether or not we want this to be a federally protected right. Should we be having taxpayer money pay for it? Should Planned Parenthood be legal? Should we be killing off 15% of Generation Z? Which is a statistic, by the way. I'm fairly certain, right? Feel free to correct me. So, that's, you see from both sides different arguments, right? And obviously different people have different audiences. So you get different echo chambers, right? You have people fervently defending the right to life for a child, right? And the right to choose for a mother. And it's a matter of perspective, right? It's the fundamental idea is whether or not in case outside of cases of incest and rape and mother's danger, right? You're considering the real question is whether or not the life has value before it's born. Anyways, the more recent thing is the realization that a lot of babies that are being aborted is due to disabilities, right? Down syndrome, and other physical or mental or otherwise mental disabilities, right? Genetic malformities. And a lot of people were saying in the comments, right? A very wide majority. Of course, there's people against it, saying, oh, that's eugenics and stuff. But there's a lot of people saying that, if you're not able to provide a good life for a child, you should not be having them. And and there was a lot of people also saying in the comments, right? Oh, sorry, I'm not rich. Sorry, I don't have all this money to support children, or it's already hard to support a disabled or child. But that makes sense, right? Money is a big problem right now. Money is tight, especially if you're young. But then comes the question about, of course, that standard, right? The standard of abortion being fundamentally about the whether or not a fetus is a life, that is out of the question, because now you are focusing on whether or not the baby's life has value based on its attributes. And it's incredibly selfish to, in either regards, in either way, whether a fetus has life or value or not, because obviously pro-abortionists still have babies too when they want them. It brings into the question whether or not the one axis of determining a baby's worth is its ability and your ability to care for it. This makes no sense, first of all, in a wide-scale basis. We talk a lot about population on this channel, but the countries with the highest birth rates are the poorest often, right? I'm doing a current research independent study right now, which I'll probably put on this channel sometime in the future. But it's incredibly selfish to prioritize your own physical or material wealth over the potential life that you would have had, but you're now limiting simply because it has Down syndrome, right? That is, I believe, evil and incredibly selfish, and people don't understand that choice does not remove you from accountability, from responsibility. Just because you have choice doesn't mean, just because you have a choice doesn't mean that there's not a right one to make. Just because you have choice, just because something is legally sanctioned, doesn't mean that you actually need to go through with it. Because what we're promoting right now is this intense mindset of, thinking of yourself over the duties you have to society. And this has been well documented, but we're going to now talk about population crises. So we've talked many times. I encourage you to check out the video, the current the collapse people won't talk to. Something, the video essay one, right? The one that's not a podcast. And people don't really realize, because of the world we live in now, where we have so much money, so much wealth, that in reality that we still need to have children. And that a society fails when it fails to produce enough children. And this goes back thousands of years. If you want to talk about anthropology, right? The only societies and the religions that succeeded are the ones that promote childbirth, and that often turn into women staying at home and men having harems sometimes. If you want to look at certain religions, right, back in the day, thousands and thousands of years I'm talking about. But that was the priority, because if you didn't do that, your neighboring, small tribe or the small nation would outcompete you simply based on your fertility. Because remember, right, birth rates were way different back then, where you need to have 10 kids and maybe 3 will survive past 20. And that was the big limiting factor, right? And we don't have that anymore, so we kind of forget the importance of having children because there's this whole pipeline. I talk about it in that video. Of course, it's like 15 minutes. I encourage you to watch it. It's like a pretty well done video essay, I think, where if you don't have enough kids, the kids cannot work. You don't have enough people. You'd have less people working, and therefore less product or output to be spread amongst the elderly who cannot work and need support from the society, right? Obviously, civilizations are judged based on the way they treat their elders. And if you cannot provide enough labor, which in turn provides value that can be dispersed, among the elderly, then you have a real crisis where you have millions of veterans possibly, or like old elderly dying in the streets because they don't have any social security, or they don't have any social safety networks. And that keeps going, and then eventually your country fails because if the bottom group, if like the youngest generation is smaller than the last, or at least not equal, then there's less people who will have kids, which means that there's going to be less kids statistically, right? Unless everyone had like 17 kids, which isn't happening right now. And then that smaller group gives birth to a smaller group, which, and then you just go down that whole pipeline, and then which is why South Korea at the current rates is going to have 4 people left for every 100 that there is now by 2100, if this current trend goes with a 0.75, 0.77 birth rate. And people forget that, and because this is mainly due to selfishness. In Korean, there is a term that stuck with me as a child. It's called 나오지기면, or like 나하나면. So it's very hard to translate into the English because of the tone it has. And that's the culture it comes from. Cultures are different. And Korea is very collectivist as a rice farming culture, back to the axial ages and stuff, because you need a lot of cooperation, and which is what to do rice farming because of its intensity, which is why East Asian cultures are often more collectivist, which is why we operate through a more family-oriented lens or clan-oriented lens and not by the individual. Because if you're an individual being creative, you back in the day would risk ruining the rice harvest, or you were unproductive as a member. Anyways, based on that, there is a different term, and there is a very certain disdain for people who are selfish, and that is what that term tries to encapsulate, that phrase. And essentially, if I had to translate it, it's if it's only me. If it's only me, it's okay. If only I litter, it's okay. It's just one plastic bottle. It's one straw. It's only one thing, and therefore it's okay. That's this whole mindset that South Koreans and I guess a lot of Confucian-ish cultures abhor, because that is the worst form of selfishness, where you are doing something so tiny, so tiny, but it's bad, where it doesn't always seem like a big deal to you, and you're thinking in your head, right, it really isn't a big deal because it's just me. But then you realize that like a lot of people, they think similar things, and especially the bad parts of humanity are the ones shared around. And once you get more people thinking like this, the ones who are selfish, the ones who think that if it's only me, it's okay, that's how you get thousands and thousands of paper bags in the ocean, back in your landscape, in the trees. That's how you get oil spills. That's how you get environmental irresponsibility, right? If you're an oil company, let's say there's like 7 more in your oil tycoon, you spill some oil. All right, it's only me, it's fine. But unbeknownst to you, every other single oil tycoon is saying the same thing. So then you get a problem where no one is being held accountable for anything, and everyone thinks that they are in the right because they're the only ones doing it. And that gets into my point about births. We've talked a lot about this. Again, I keep saying this, that I want you to check out the videos, obviously, as a YouTuber and marketer, but this is the mindset that pervades a lot of people. I'm rich. I'm not rich, so I don't need to have a kid. I don't have the funds. I don't want to raise a disabled child. I don't want to raise a child. I don't have the money. I want to spend money on myself. Someone else will have, that part might not even be in their heads. But the duty to have children, which is a real thing, by the way, in all successful countries, nations, and cultures, that is not a part of life to them because of their selfishness. Again, 나 하나만. If it's only me not having kids, that's fine. I'm just me. I'm an individual. And I understand that, right? If you don't have the funds to like have a kid in like urban New York City and live in that shitty apartment, right? That is your choice. But then why are people in Nigeria having 8.7 kids or births per woman? I don't know if that's the actual number. It's like closer to 9, I think. Why is that? They can't afford stuff. They're not living in like great sanitation and one of the greatest cities in the world, then why is that? Is it religion? Perhaps. We definitely have to consider that too. But it's more this expectation that other people will take care of small things for us. But then again, as we talked about with the oil tycoons and the littering, the more people, you don't realize it, but a lot of people are ascribing to this type of thinking. More people are thinking this way. More people are thinking, if I don't have kids, it's okay. It's my life. They have no mind for the collective. They have no mind for the greater society and their country and their future, because not only are they, of course, not misinformed, but uneducated on this issue, because we don't talk about it. It's like a bit taboo to talk about, fertility and stuff. But we live in a world where it doesn't really make sense for us to really consider this. We live in a world where we can have all these material comforts, where of course we still must work a lot for it, but we have all these nice things and we don't want to give it up just because we want to have a kid, right? So that's how this whole pipeline goes. The more people who think that, oh, I don't have money, so I don't need to have a kid, or I don't want to, if I can't give my kid a good life, they're better off dead in the womb, or they're better off aborted. That's not the point. The point isn't about you. The point isn't about, oh, I'm just thinking of myself, and, you might try to act benevolent by saying, oh, I can't provide for my kid. But of course, that's a factor, but people do it all. Again, the poorest countries are the ones with the most kids. Obviously, the birth rates aren't sustainable at the current rate. But in America, we're at least high enough, like 1.7, I think, where we're not completely screwed like France or Germany. Well, I guess Germany's recovering right now. I don't know, like South Korea or China or something, right? We're not completely screwed, but we're on our way there, and we have the chance to improve things. But it's a selfish mindset, this lack of collective thinking, the lack of even an inkling, an iota of a consideration for the duty they have to the whole world, for their country, for their culture, for society. It's this lack of understanding which manifests as selfishness. And I think that is one of the biggest crises we face today, because it simply doesn't make sense how we got to this point. How we lost all forms of collectivism. How are we at the point where we don't understand that there are real things that matter, and that culture matters, and that people matter, because people are the ones that make up culture. And if we want to keep America the way it is now, or at least keep it advancing in this this forward marching way, we need to have children, and immigrants cannot be the ones keeping our population up. They cannot be the ones propping up our populations. Because guess what? Once those immigrant countries start doing better, or once those the countries that supply us with immigrants, once they are unable to send immigrants because their birth rates are low, what are we going to do? And this is the thought that should be entering every single Western or modernized country's mind. But ultimately, again, policy doesn't matter, because societies, governments, cultures, nations, you might call them, manifestations of government or certain documents. In America, it certainly is. But ultimately, it's a reflection of the people it has. And the people in a culture or society matters, because that's what it is based on. Your genetics matter. Yes, they do. Your ethnicity matters. Your skin color. All these things, we don't like to admit it, but these things matter when forming a culture. And that doesn't mean we should do eugenics. That's the whole point I'm trying to get across, right? We're not trying to do that. But you have a duty to your people, to your culture. And if you have lost all soul, if you have lost all, inkling of duty, then that's a problem. And as I see it, pervade more and more throughout society now, it's becoming evident what the problem is. America was once, to a certain degree, collectivist, to the point where we had good communities and we had a certain level of understanding, mostly due to the power influence of the Catholic or Protestant churches. We do not have that anymore. America saw at the very least a 16-point decrease ever since the new millennium in people who were very religious, and an even greater amount who declared that they were somewhat religious. So we don't have that church connection anymore. And therefore, what made America collectivist, which is the religious influence, has been degrading. Because it's not a part of our, core conscience, because we are, descendants of the individualist mindsets of the Protestant Christian era. But there's nothing we can really do to remedy that, because What is there to do? You cannot change selfishness in people's minds with policy. If people are not choosing to have children because of the costs involved, that's because they don't want to have children and they don't feel the duty or need to, and no amount of government money or subsidies will fix that. We talk a lot about these child tax credits. We talk a lot about, we talk a lot about how can we help young families afford children. That's not the point. How can we incentivize people who aren't going to have children to have children? And that's the real question, right? The people who are going to have children, by and large, are going to have more than one. If you're going to have if you're in a position where you can, fund a family. So the bigger question really should be, how are we going to fund families? How are we going to, not fund families, sorry. How are we going to encourage families and compel families without this financial stability to have children? And the answer is you can't. The government can only do so much because although it's, elected by the people, it's simply a social institution that seeks to regulate, but not to connect. The government fails in this because you cannot legislate morality. Legislation is a component of morality, but it cannot create morality in and of itself. If people have lost the edge to have children despite the fact they don't have the money for it, and that includes myself as well, right? We do not have the incentive. We do not have this, duty in our minds to pursue this because it simply is more convenient for us. And it is selfish because we don't consider the potential consequences of everyone thinking like us. If everyone thought like me or you, or someone, if everyone thought like me and like, I don't know, Jane Doe, who doesn't want to have kids because we don't, consider it as a duty, and we consider our own material comfort and well-being and possibly the comfort of children, I guess, when they grow up. If we consider that over everything else, then there's literally no hope because you cannot legislate people into believing that children matter and they are a priority, because it simply isn't that way. And because of the erosion of our social institutions, whether it be the church or our public communities, right? Because of the erosions of those different aspects of society, we don't have this sort of expectation that we're going to have support outside of money or outside of our own families for children. We don't have this idea that it's our duty to have children. And I'm really going around in a circle here because I think it's really important. But the ultimate point I'm trying to make on this is that I think the biggest problem when it comes to the birth and population crisis, at least in America, is that we are extremely selfish when it comes to our understanding of our duty to have children, to provide people for the future and for ourselves. Because the reality is, if our generation, which is already smaller than, like the baby boomers, for example, do not have children at a positive birth rate, right, above replacement, then we will be, of course, Social Security is fucked anyways, but we will not have access to all these nice things when we are the elderly. We will not have access to all these nice things that current, elderly people are able to have to a certain degree because there will not be enough people to provide and create surplus revenue because labor matters. And that's ultimately the point I was trying to get to about selfishness. There was a few more I wanted to get into, and one of them was about something similar, I guess. So not exactly about selfishness, but more going back to the real disappointment I had when looking at the types of thoughts people had when it came to choice and also goodness. I'm gonna go on a little bit, like an anthropological kind of like rant here, but people a lot of times really don't understand that the scope of the world, the history of it, and the depth of culture. So let me explain. As I explained before, culture is made of people. You take a bunch of people who are very similar or have similar ideas. They will create customs around those values and ideas based on their unique geographical and social needs. That is a real thing. And we need to understand this when looking back in the past, because we need to understand why things were, what the hell am I saying? Why things were the way that they were, and why things right now are possibly contradictory to other things. But of course, we'll explain why that might be valid. It might not be. So the first thing I'll say is about the gender issue. So we talk a lot about the patriarchy and how it's oppressive, and oftentimes it is 100% true. The patriarchy has been very oppressive to women in the past, and this goes beyond not providing them opportunities outside of the household, right? This goes to, stuff like foot binding, genital mutilation, shaming, all these, lack of opportunities for them, unless you're, of course, in the elite. And we explain why. And it's very hard to find a reason why when it comes to actual modern, like, social discussions, because it doesn't seem like we have enough understanding about the history of the world and why things are the way that they are to fully understand why this is. And I'll break it down for you. But first, let's start with the quote. Traditions are answers to problems we have forgotten. Wait. Oh, yeah. Answers. Wait, sorry. What the hell am I saying? Traditions are solutions to problems we forgot existed. Yeah, that's the one. So what does this say? So tradition is customs. This could be stuff like patriarchy, but it could also be stuff like certain, garments, or it could be certain religious or, rituals, right? All of these things count as tradition. And the one we'll be talking about mainly, as I've pretty handily laid out, is going to be the patriarchy. Why does this make sense? Well, let's really look back. And this goes beyond the whole, hunter-gatherer, men were stronger, so they went out and worked. Because that's one component, but it also it also mattered when it came to societies, right? Societies and civilization past hunter-gatherer ages. Of course, the seeds might have been planted then, but all those seeds, all those, hunter-gatherer ages, all that tells us, most people know that stuff, right? Men are stronger naturally, but they also have something called testosterone. We have something called testosterone, right? And it causes you to be extremely aggressive, to seek danger, to take risks, and it also helps you, muscle up, right? What the hell am I saying? So we all understand this. We all understand that the most violent and most aggressive time for young men is in their 20s, which is why most of the crime done, the petty and violent crime done by anyone, is young men in their 20s or, late teens or possibly their early 30s. And also explains why the 100th most aggressive people on Earth are men, right? That's not to say a woman can't be aggressive, but the peak of aggression is going to be 100% men, maybe 99 out of 100, right? And you need to understand that this doesn't always manifest in violence. Aggression might sound like a negative word, but it can be tunneled, it can be channeled into different places. And what this means is that it can be channeled into goodness. It can be channeled into working to make a good house for your wife and family. It can be channeled into creating great things for society. And this is what certain societies realized, and they made the adaptation. You need to have your young men who are the most aggressive, the most vicious, the most risk-taking, to provide for society in those times, because those are the most driven, the most powerful, and the most aggressive, especially back in the times when we didn't have software jobs, right? And to that degree, there was a sort of social contract made between a lot of different societies, but basically it required the submission of females. That way, the males would do good things for society, and then in return, either the father or the patriarch of the family, of the female, or the females themselves, would select the most successful men. And that's why we have standards for success in men today. Because as every society has evolved to have that. Every society, to a certain degree, has evolved in a way, or it was created in a way, that oppressed women. That way, men would basically be able to work hard and then gain their wife as a slave, basically, right? That was a social contract, because otherwise you didn't have enough field hands, you didn't have enough people doing the hard work in society, because there was no incentive. Without an incentive, without something to work to, you just turn to crime. You get a lot of crime, and societies that didn't implement what I'm just talking about, they faded out of existence. There's millions of societies and civilizations that we'll never hear about because they were simply unsuccessful and were outcompeted by their neighbors, who perhaps did practice what I'm talking about. And it shouldn't be taboo to say this kind of thing, because that's simply the way it's, to a degree, understood to have worked, right? The societies that didn't use their young men to their greatest ability, whether it be for war or agriculture or, smithing, those societies faded out. And that is ultimately what it comes down to. There's an old African proverb, the men who are rejected by their village will burn it down to feel its warmth, something like that, right? And that was the big danger. That's something most successful societies understood. If you don't have anything for your young men to divert their aggression to, then they will simply turn to literally just aggression, violence, crime, all these different things that tore down the social fabric of a society. And so you had to kind of make these perverse incentives that did oppress women, that kept them in the household, that kept them making children, which also definitely has like the whole like fertility matters kind of things. Back then, like 9 out of 10 children died before 20. But anyways, that was what had to be done to make sure your society worked. Remember, like, people make up societies, and societies also need to fight other societies, or else you get outcompeted and you lose your resources, especially back when resources were the #1 indicator for success. So if your society had equality between men and women, there was no expectation of, good things for men if they worked hard, then you would just simply have more crime for the ones who are unable to work hard, because there's no incentive for them to do so. And if you didn't keep women in the house pumping out 10 babies, like, in their lifetime, then you would have less children, because if you don't have 10 kids, you're not going to have like 3 people surviving from them, right? Not only would the birth mother possibly die very often during childbirth, many of the children would die in infancy, in their young ages from like disease, and in general, they wouldn't make it past 17, 18, 19, 20. So ultimately, there is a reason. That is the reason why the patriarchy exists now. Because the societies that were unable to compel their women to stay in the home and make 10 babies in their lifetime were outcompeted by the other ones. And of course, this is like a bunch of stuff that you need to like learn stuff for anthropologically. But if you're going to make statements about the evil of patriarchy and how it never should have been implemented, you're misunderstanding the historical precedents, and you're also misunderstanding why it's not necessary anymore. It takes a whole understanding. The patriarchy is no longer necessary because we have very, very, very good infant mortality rates, right? It's been like this, and then it just drops down in the Industrial Revolution with the invention of common medicine and better practices for birthing mothers, right? So if you want to say the patriarchy is bad, don't say, oh, it was evil and it oppressed women. You need to have a good understanding of why it was that way, which is because of the anthropological and social pressures that cultures had. And then you'll also need to understand why it doesn't apply anymore. Not only I'll get into that in a bit. The main thing you want to realize about this issue, at least, is that the infant mortality rate is so low that you don't need 10 kids in your lifetime to make sure that 3 survive. If you have 3 kids, chances are all 3 are making it to like 60, right? Bar like any issues, especially in the West with modernized medicine. So if you want to decry the patriarchy, understand that part. And if you really want to get into the issue of violence in young men, right? That's a bit complicated because like crime rates are technically dropping, but that also is due to like over medication of people. Shoot. So I don't really know how to get into it for like the male aggression part, but that's certainly still an issue that we see a lot, and it is still something to be desired, and that's why the military still prioritizes young men, right? It is the most logical decision. You know why? And go back 2,000 years, the military that didn't use their young men, they lost. The societies that didn't use their young men to their fullest potential lost in wars. They lost in e-commerce. They lost in agriculture. And that's what you need to understand, that everything that we criticize now has a reason, and you also need to have a reason why, things shouldn't be the way that they were now. And that takes knowledge, that takes research. But if you're going to simply go off of an emotional argument, as I was saying earlier, oh, it's so evil, it was so oppressive, it's because men are evil, that's not the point. Of course, most people understand that this isn't the reason, but you need to also understand that that cannot be the reason. You need to have an understanding to make statements that are bombastic as the ones just like saying that patriarchy has no place in history and that, it should have been eliminated. And who knows? With the way things are going now with lowering birth rates, we might find out that these traditions may have had some purpose. Of course, I like equality. I'm still a person of the 21st century, and I am used to it. I'm used to treating women as equals, and I would like for that to continue. But it could be the case that in 200 years, we find out that because of the lowering birth rates, because this immense equality where men had no incentives, right? You're seeing the connection here. I guess the aggression part can be explained by like sort to a certain degree like internet pornography, where like if you want your sexual needs to be like sated, right? You can simply turn to these alternative options, and you also need women to be extremely selective, right? So like okay, so I guess I'll start from the beginning. Normally, you would need women or their patriarchs to be extremely selective of who their like daughter or themselves are able to mate with or to at least have a marriage with. That way, you have men working really hard so they can get that a woman, right? That's how it worked. That was the social contract of, I don't know, 4000 BC. But the lower the standards are now, the worse that becomes, because now we have less reason to work, and the people who don't work have all these different vices, right? People who aren't able to, divert their aggression and their work into greatness, they just simply turn to like pornography. That's what it's an experiment that's been happening for the last like 60 years, right? And especially with like free sex, with the sex revolution of the 1960s and the invention of the birth control pill, you really, really don't need to work hard to get with a girl, right? I'm sure most people, especially like the hookup culture is a thing. I know of people that, right? It's like, you don't need to work hard and build a great world empire for yourself to engage in reproduction, right? Which is like one of the main functions of society. And also, it doesn't help that the testosterone rates have been dropping like rapidly over the last 30 years, where it's kind of scary. But that's really irrelevant from the issue. Probably, I don't know. I'll have to think about it more. But anyways, my point is, if you really want to like, if people make all these impassioned speeches and these, and I admire their passion about these social issues, and their empathy is to be, of course, uplifted. But if you're going to talk, you might as well talk with some understanding of the history and why things are the way that they are. Next point, marriage. So we hear a lot about marriage, right? It was a bigger issue back in the 90s and the early 2000s, right? With gay marriage and stuff. But you need to think about why marriage exists. A lot of people kind of forget that point, right? We're like, oh, gay marriage is about love between two people, and they can have kids if they want, which is kind of weird. I don't know about wanting. It's something about duty to society. We've been talking about that a lot this video. I don't think anyone's watching at this point, but I'm here to like talk because I really want to. What was I saying? Oh, right. Yes. The historical point of marriage. Let's take a deep dive real quick into why marriage is the way it is between a man and a woman, and why it technically doesn't make sense for a gay marriage to exist. And then also a real argument for why it should exist. So the current argument for why it should exist is, oh, marriage is about love. You don't want to prevent people from having love, and it's like you want to not infringe on freedom. But why exactly is marriage a government institution now? For tax benefits, to have kids, obviously. That's the real answer. Anyways, so why is marriage an institution that exists, and how has our understanding of that been deeply perverted by the recent history in the sexual revolution, as we'll get into, in the 1960s. So let's start with this, right? Marriage is an institution that spans across many different cultures, across many different time periods in history, but ultimately it boils down to a matrimony between a man and a woman that is permanent and everlasting. And sometimes you have multiple women involved, because one man can do the job of like 5 men, right? You can impregnate 5 women, but women can't get pregnant with 5 babies consistently, right? Because obviously childbirth is one of the main priorities. Anyways, yeah, so why does it exist, and why has it existed in all these different places? It's to provide the most basic safety net, for a social safety net for children. although the community is involved, you still need a child needs a mother and a father. Like psychology shows this, and exposure to your mother and father for long periods of time is extremely beneficial for the child's growth. Also, it prevents sex out of marriage because here's the thing. All of the things I said earlier that are happening today happen when sex isn't strictly about, reproduction. And by stressing that, you're able to prevent people from acting on their urges without actually having the idea of having kids. And it also ensures that diseases like syphilis and stuff can't be spread too bad because there should only be two people engaging with, reproductive activities within each other. That didn't really make sense. All right, basically, marriage exists to protect society from sexual deviation, and also to ensure. How do I explain this? Is always so. It's like in my mind, but I can't like verbalize it in a way. I don't know. So I need to spin it while I think. You guys can watch with me. Ooh, okay. I don't think that part's good to eat. I'm gonna like spit this out. So a good way to put it is that marriage is, at least in like the monogamous, I'm gonna kill the monogamous marriages exist the way they are, as to prevent sex from being viewed as anything except about reproduction, and also to make sure that you have people to ground the father, and to also create incentives to care for your children, because it is your duty in society, and is beaten to us, or was beaten to people in the societies that was the case. Because otherwise, you would have, by and large, because of the stuff I was talking about earlier with the patriarchy, men predating on women on large. But if you have this connection between one man and one woman, and this idea of ownership, which is bad to us now but was a thing back then, if you have this idea of ownership, you can prevent people. You by and large prevent men from becoming I guess like overly. There's a reason adultery was considered a sin, because it's unproductive, it's bad for society. I don't know how to exactly verbalize this, but there is extreme function in there is extreme value, how about this, in making sure that sex is only about reproduction. And marriage is a really, really good way to incentivize this by ensuring that you will have sex only after marriage, at least in Christian tradition. That way, you are guaranteed to have certain obligations to society and the child. Otherwise, it's all meaningless, right? Otherwise, it's just like, what is love? What is marriage? What is sex, right? It's just an abstract thing that you do for recreation, is how we see it today, right? But let's think back. Again, you need to consider the historical and physical conditions of people in the past. What did it mean to have sex? They didn't really have necessarily advanced contraception or the birth control pill like we do now. Therefore, sex equals baby. That was like the understanding, right? That was like the traditional understanding, and because that's really how it was. Also, sex with too many people equals syphilis or other types of sexually transmitted diseases, right? So marriage is your hedge against that. Marriage as a society prevents, babies born without a very close support structure. It prevents sexually transmitted diseases from going around everywhere. And it also, at least in a nuclear family model, it provides the basis for society. Obviously, that wasn't the case for all of history, and you have polygamous marriages, but it limits the amount of people that you're able to have intercourse with, because intercourse almost always leads to a baby when you don't have proper contraception around. And you might call that oppressive, but that's only really changed because of the new standards created in the 1960s. Marriage was once about creating a union and a baby, because you don't have sex until marriage. Therefore, marriage is about baby, because sex equals baby. That was the initial understanding of why that was the case. And as I speak about this, I'm starting to understand it more and more as I actually verbalize this out loud to this camera in my basement at 11 p.m. It's always sad. But anyways, that all changed, right? The meaning of marriage changed once sex became free back in the 1950s, 60s, I guess closer to the 60s. And and because of medical advances, but also the birth control pill, sex became no longer directly tied to childbirth. And therefore, the institution of marriage is more symbolic now than actually functional, because so many people, so many babies are being born out of wedlock, no matter your race, right? So many babies are being born out of wedlock now than ever before. And there's also no child to keep families together, which is why we have more divorces. Obviously, families still have divorces with children, but we let that happen. It's also, if you have children, you're less likely to divorce, which is why you have that whole trope of staying together for the kids. Anyways, understanding why that all changed helps you make that distinction now if you want to support gay marriage. You need to understand that marriage means nothing now because sex means nothing now, because sex is not equivalent to a baby, and marriage is not necessary, and because marriages have no obligation to bear children, marriages are a useless institution functionally to society. And that's the cold hard bitter truth. You might say that, of course it keeps families together for the sake of the children, but that's increasingly less the case. The divorce rate's going up, the children out of wedlock is going up, so clearly marriage is not doing its job as an institution, because it doesn't functionally do anything anymore, because the whole idea of marriage was initially to make sure that you cannot have sex with other people, to prevent syphilis, and to also create a basic social safety net for your children. It's really that simple. I think the syphilis thing is probably bigger, and like the societies that didn't do that really like suffered on large from syphilis and like other STDs, right? But ultimately, that's what it comes down to. If you want to make the argument for gay marriage, don't be like, oh my god, it's so bigoted. No, marriage means nothing, so you might as well have gay marriage. That's like the answer right there. Obviously, I might be wrong in this, and you might disagree with me. But to me, you don't simply make the argument that, oh, this is bigoted. No, you understand that marriage means nothing now because of the sexual revolution, and therefore gay marriages shouldn't really matter. Like, that's ultimately the case. Like, even I, as a conservative, believe that gay marriage makes sense now because marriage doesn't mean anything. That's not me being like, right, that, like, what am I supposed to say to that? And to explain all of this in one conversation, right, we're on 47 minutes already. To explain all this in one conversation is extremely difficult, which is why people don't do it. And which is why it makes me sad that so many impassioned people are allowing emotions to become the main standard for their politics. History should be. If you want to talk about society, talk about history, really. Like, if you want to talk about, like, oh, why, don't cry xenophobia. You want to explain why. Or let's talk about immigration now. Final part of this bloated, probably hour-long video of me just talking and my voice is going out now. If you want to talk about immigration, you need to understand that human migrations were always a thing, and that people make cultures, right? Cultures are not a standalone thing that can be applied anywhere. And people do not adapt as easily as we think. If I move to South Korea, despite being a Korean, raised in a Korean family, speaking Korean as my first language, I will not be culturally Korean as I can be. I will not understand the slang for at least a very long time. I will not, to a certain degree, understand some of the things. That's because I was raised in an American mindset, and despite Korea being super capitalist now, I cannot ever really capture that initial Korean collective spirit. I can try, and honestly, I'm trying to get close, but it's not possible. For that same reason, if you have someone from a Muslim country moving to Europe, which is a very meta example, they're not going to, even if they try, they will not fully adapt to the, they will not adapt to eating, sausages the German way or beer, because it's a contrarian to their religion, but it's a big part of German culture, right? Obviously, I'm simplifying it a lot, but that is ultimately a fact of life, that migrations happen throughout human history, and never once are things truly preserved. Even the Romans, every time they invaded some like random whack ass place in like Western Europe or like, I don't know, the Balkans, the Romans absorbed some of the stuff and some of the customs and some of the good parts of the cultures that they absorbed. This means more so that also that the people being conquered adopted Roman ways. You know, they paid taxes, they can own land, they perhaps held assemblies. They had, you know, some of them went to vote in Rome, you know, take their little like, aristocratic course back, right? And what that ultimately shows is that places change, often for the better, but sometimes, very often, for the worse. Why did I say often twice? Sometimes for the better, but sometimes for the worse. And not every change is good. Because humans create culture. Culture does not exist on its own, and cultures change when humans are changed. You replace the populations of Iran, and you replace the population of Argentina. You swap them. Every single person suddenly, obviously, like, you know, moves to their country. Their languages change. Their values change. And they will, sorry, other way around. Their languages and their values will mold the country into who they are. And they will not, you know, there might be some change, there might be some acceptance. But if you replace every Argentinian with an Iranian, they will not start playing soccer en masse, and they will not be speaking Spanish. Because ultimately, the culture you are is reliant on the people who make it up. And if you change the people, you change the culture. That's what we're trying to understand here, right? And so you see a lot of you see this happening, right? You see this happening across history. Let me think of a good example. A great example is America. Not America as like the melting pot, but specific ethnic examples. Chinese people came to America, and after their initial, of course, few hundred years of very, very bad treatment, they created a unique culture that pervaded all of America and also changed Chinese cuisine in America forever. We've all heard of it. Orange chicken isn't actually Chinese. The way we do like dim sum here is different, right? So all of these different things changed American society. Chinese food is now an integral part of American society. However, it does not at all reflect the ethnic makeup of the people. However, because Americans, the culture of America has changed, so it works out. We're used to this in America. We're used to immigrants coming in and changing things for the better, and we all adapt to it because we're used to adapting things to it, right? That's been the history of America. You know, through thick or thin, through racism and, you know, all of the segregation with immigrants and, you know, like slaves, right? Through thick or thin, all of these parts have actually eventually changed culture in America, and we all benefit for the better from it. Which is why we get blues, we get rap music, we get country, we get, you know, pasta, and we get lobsters, and we get all of these nice things that only happen because people came and changed it. However, this is not the case in more ossified, or I guess like more stagnant civilizations like Western Europe, which is still, despite losing its religion, culturally Christian or Catholic, and still has a unique culture which is based on its ethnicity. Ethnicity is a big part of the culture. If I'm in a village of people who look like me, talk like me, think like me, it's much easier than being in a group where people don't look like me, don't think like me, don't speak my language, because that's simply how it is. I mean, try to force those people into, like, let's say there's like 10 of me, 2 of random person who doesn't have any of my values. They bring them into me. They will change me for the worse, and I will probably not be very good at working with them because there is very little that we share and very little that I can learn and take. And instead, they need to try to adapt. They need to adapt to the 10 of me that exist, and perhaps in the process, bring in their, you know, and simply by being themselves, they will change me slightly, probably for the better if I let it happen. However, if you do not try to assimilate, if you do not try as as immigrants in general, if you don't fully embrace the culture you're trying to join, then you are going to simply create yourself a little bubble for yourself which is why, some people in America, like immigrants, don't learn to speak English. You create yourself a bubble where you can do nothing, and you are nothing because you mean nothing to the society you are a part of. However, if you start coming en masse and you do not change the way you are, the ways you think, the ways you speak, the ways you eat, all these things to fit the current existing culture, then you are simply going to get yourself ostracized. And that's what's happening now. So if you want to really cry about xenophobia, you need to understand that cultural change due to populations don't happen when populations are forcefully inserted. That is called like a Roman time shift, where you're simply taking over somewhere. You take a little bit maybe, but ultimately the people there are still the people there, and you're not really meshing into actual culture. The Romans did it well. And that's because people liked the Roman way of living because it was really effective and they also had a really good military. However, if you move to Europe, if you move to America, and you do not have Western values of equality, freedom, progressivism, which, believe it or not, all of us do, right? If you don't have these, and if you don't change yourself to actually have these, you will never get what you want. It's in the process of adapting that you understand that I am becoming a part of this culture. However, because I am unique and I have these certain backgrounds, I will inadvertently change the culture. I will not force my way in. And that's how cultural change happens. Chinese food isn't a thing in America because Chinese people, millions and billions of Chinese people, why do I sound like Trump there? Millions of Chinese people came into America and started building their own little areas, and they, demanded that everyone eat Chinese food. It happens because Chinese people, in the process of trying to adapt to Americans, they have their own foods that they like, right? Chinese fried food is very good. But they try to cater American food to Americans, which is why Chinese food is much sweeter and saltier here than in China. It's more fried food too. And in the process, you create something new. But you would not have had that had the Chinese came here and tried to force Americans to like the Chinese way of eating, which a lot of us, not us, I like Chinese food, which a lot of Americans probably don't, which is why, same thing goes for Japanese people, which is why you see Americans dunking sushi and soy sauce on rare occasion, on common occasion, because that is the American sushi, right? California roll? They don't have avocados in Japan, right? Like, these are the innovations that happen once you try to adapt to the culture. You bring your culture and you adapt to it, to the one that exists. That is how cultural, multiculturalism is actually done. And when you see people pushing back against immigrants who are unable to adapt, unable to learn language, unable to adapt to customs, no wonder. And if you want to call those people xenophobic, what else are they supposed to feel? Really, like historically, if you had like a certain group and your survival is the main component, which isn't in our minds anymore because survival is like guaranteed and our basic needs are given. If survival is your main component in human psychology, right? Back in the monkey brain days, if you want to survive, you need people to cooperate with because that is a human strength. If you have people who are not able to actually cooperate with you, tough luck, man. Like, I don't know how to best say this, really. But ultimately, if you want to cry xenophobia at people who are against immigrants, look at the styles and the customs of immigrants going and whether or not they can actually bring any benefit. A great example of this being done over time is India and Britain. Obviously, Britain had its own time of being a colonial power in India, and as a result, a lot of talented Indian people did move to Britain, and there's a very high Indian population right now in major British cities. But you also notice that curry is a really popular dish in Britain right now, probably top 5 for any Brit, due to the lack of other foods, obviously, in Britain. But, right, like, that's a real thing that happens. And the curry in Britain is nowhere, I'm telling you, I've had it before, it's nowhere in the complexity, spice, or level as the ones found in India or, like, Thailand, right? That's because it adapted to a British culture, and it kind of got sucky because of that, for my taste buds at least, right? But, that's what happens. That's what ultimately happens once you do cultural, infusion right. And which is why, it worked out for this British India thing, because due to the British colonial rule, Indians speak English now. And then because of the spice trade, British people were also exposed to food, and Indians learned how British people eat, which must have been really depressing for them. Wow. But then ultimately, you get to the point where now we have a very diverse Britain, which maybe isn't working out for them because there's more and more people now who see this, move there, but they ossify. They don't try to change for the culture that they're trying to go into, and try to maintain the same way that they are. I don't mean when you take stuff in naturally. I'm talking about you need to make an active effort to infuse into the culture you are a part of. Therefore, you might actually be able to participate in society and become a normal part. Which is why, for example, this is a personal opinion for me, but you move to America, you're no longer Indian American, Ugandan American, Korean American. You are just American, and you simply have a different skin color. You might want to keep your ethnic heritage, but no, don't do that. That is a part of you, but okay. You are a part of your culture, but your culture is not a part of you, especially if you immigrated, right? The second you get American citizenship, you have a duty to become American, but in the process of completely assimilating, because you are not initially like a WASP, like American, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, because you're not a WASP, right? You're going to automatically bring change just by being you. In the effort of becoming American, in the effort of integrating, that is where actual cultural change comes from. So if you really want to cry xenophobia, right, if you really want to say that this is a problem, you need to understand the historical importance of migration, and that it's not really a lightly taken issue in a lot of places, especially not in America. In America, we're used to change because change is the American way. The Constitution is notably a document designed to be changed, right? That is a part of our people, the American race. That is not the case for homogenous societies like Germany, like Poland, like Denmark, like Norway, like Finland. It's like 99% Finnish or I guess like Scandinavian there. No wonder they don't like having people come in and change it. Hungarians, Balkans. The Balkans are literally a region composed of certain ethnic groups to make it make sense and stop them from bitching at each other for the whole time in Yugoslavia. For the same thing, you come into Korea, you're not going to feel welcome as an immigrant who doesn't actually properly adjust. Even if you do, you are not going to be accepted because people are naturally tribalistic and racist. If you see a white person or black person in Korea speaking, talking, walking, and acting like a Korean, sure, they're doing their part, but that's supposed to be expected. You're still not going to be fully, integrated, but you need to understand that and understand the value you bring in your efforts to integrate. And that's really my last point now. There's a few other things I would have liked to talk about. For example, I guess real quick, people don't understand the atrocities that happened in history. They don't understand. Most people don't know Pol Pot, Khmer Rouge. They don't know about the tragedies of the Holodomor or the Great Leap Forward. And so when they say that, tragedies are created by white people and imperialists in the 20th and 21st century, 19th century. Learn the history first. Oh, and one final note. I don't know, bro, no one's watching this right now. This is for myself in the future, I guess. The right way needs to do a better job at incorporating conservative non-white people, because they always cry. I mean, it's true to a certain degree, but they always cry about, these white conservatives feel left out of society. And they're so it's all conservative, especially men, right, and include women as well, right? Don't exclude people like me from the whole conservative sphere because we're not white. Asians are technically white in the views of the intersectionalists, but dude, I don't even know. If you made it this far, dude, thank you, man. I don't even know what you're doing, man or woman, I guess. But yeah, I made this on impulse because I thought this was really important, and these are really deep personal issues to me, because I see people thinking like this and talking like this in the real life, and they don't have any grasp of the history, anthropology, or the actual reasons why things are the way that they are, and they don't know why they are promoting the things that they are. Because the things we think now are only molded to a certain degree by the things that people thought in the past generation. We are products of our parents and our forefathers ideologically. Therefore, nothing we think now is completely novel, and everything and the basic assumptions that we have, for example, like marriage being about love and not about preventing syphilis, right? that's something that you got to consider. That's something that you need to know. And it's just disappointing seeing that so many people with all this internet out there can't come to some basic conclusions. So really, I do hope I do my part in being that part of that internet that provides people with some knowledge, or at least a different perspective, right? I acknowledge I'm probably wrong about some of these things, right? There's probably some anthropologists out there that disagrees with me, but also some that agree. And that's kind of the fun part. So, I look forward to talking about all of this in the comments if anyone even made it this far, but this is mostly for me. Anyways, as always, it's been the Rhetoric Feud. If you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, questions, concerns, or talk about anything, discussion, comments, peace.